London, 1851. The grand pianoforte in the east drawing-room of the Dashwood residence had never sounded more perfect or more lifeless, and Georgiana Dashwood knew it even as her fingers executed the final flourish of Mozart's sonata in C major with flawless precision. The applause that followed her performance was polite, measured, exactly what one would expect from an assembly of Mayfair's finest families gathered for an evening musicale. But Georgiana heard the hollowness beneath those gloved hands meeting in tepid appreciation. At 26 years of age, she had long since perfected the art of reading what society truly thought beneath its veneer of courtesy. And as she rose from the bench and curtsied to acknowledge the applause, she caught the whispered conversation between Lady Henrietta Morland and her daughter near the refreshment table. The words carried just far enough for Georgiana to hear, as perhaps they were meant to. "Technically flawless, of course," Lady Morland murmured behind her fan, "but one does wish for some feeling in the performance. It's rather like watching a music box, all mechanical precision with no soul whatsoever." Her daughter replied in equally hushed tones that carried none the less. No wonder she remains unmarried at her age. What gentleman wants a wife who plays like a governess giving lessons? Even her face shows nothing when she performs, as if the music is merely an obligation rather than a joy. Georgiana maintained her composure as she made her way through the crowded drawing-room, accepting congratulations that felt like condolences, smiling at compliments that rang hollow in her ears. Her father, Lord Edmund Dashwood, nodded approvingly from his position near the fireplace, satisfied that his eldest daughter had once again demonstrated the accomplishments expected of a gentlewoman of quality. Her younger sister Lydia held court nearby, her blonde curls bouncing as she laughed at something Mr. Charles Tilney had said, drawing admiring glances from every gentleman in the vicinity with the effortless charm that Georgiana had never possessed. The drawing-room felt suddenly suffocating, too warm despite the April evening's coolness, too bright with its dozens of candles blazing in the chandelier overhead, too full of people whose eyes held judgment rather than genuine appreciation. Georgiana murmured something about needing air and slipped through the crowd toward the hallway. But instead of heading to the terrace where other guests had gathered, she found her feet carrying her toward the west wing of the house, toward the room she had been avoiding for 5 years. The abandoned music room had been her mother's sanctuary, a space where Lady Catherine Dashwood had spent hours playing with the kind of passion that had scandalized her husband and delighted her daughters. After her mother's death, Lord Dashwood had ordered the room closed, the furniture covered, the instruments left untouched as if sealing away the memory of a woman whose spirit had been too vibrant, too uncontainable for the rigid confines of proper society. Georgiana's hand trembled as she turned the tarnished brass handle, pushing open the heavy oak door that creaked in protest after years of disuse. Moonlight streamed through the tall windows that overlooked the garden, illuminating dust motes that danced in silvery beams like tiny ghosts celebrating her intrusion. White sheets draped over furniture created strange shapes in the darkness, ghostly sentinels guarding a space frozen in time. The grand pianoforte stood at the room's center, its polished rosewood surface dulled by a fine layer of dust, and Georgiana approached it as one might approach a shrine, her breath catching in her throat as memories flooded back. Her mother had sat at this very instrument, playing Chopin with such feeling that it made listeners weep, pouring her whole heart into every note until Lord Dashwood had forbidden her from performing publicly, declaring that such displays of emotion were unseemly for a woman of her station. Georgiana sank onto the bench, not bothering to remove the sheet that covered it, and placed her trembling fingers on the keys. The sound that emerged was slightly out of tune after years of neglect, but somehow that imperfection made it more honest than the perfectly maintained instrument in the drawing-room. She began to play, not Mozart this time, but one of her mother's favorite pieces, a nocturne by Chopin that required not just technical skill, but genuine feeling. And as the melody filled the abandoned room, something inside Georgiana finally broke. The tears came hot and fast, blurring her vision as her fingers stumbled over passages she had played 1,000 times. She was sobbing openly now, her carefully pinned hair loosening and falling around her shoulders, all the composure she maintained in the drawing room dissolving in this private space. "They were right," she whispered to the empty room, to her mother's ghost, to herself. "I am passionless. I play like a music box, mechanical and empty. I have become everything you never wanted me to be, everything Father demanded you become." The music room held old wood and unused space, melancholy and memories. And Georgiana let herself sink into the grief she had been holding at bay for 5 years. She wept for her mother who had died slowly after her spirit was crushed, for herself and the cage of expectation she inhabited, for the music that should bring joy, but had become merely another accomplishment to display like needlework or watercolors. Her performance tonight had been perfect, because she had carefully excised every trace of feeling from it, just as her father had taught her, just as society demanded. A proper young lady did not lose herself in music. A proper young lady demonstrated technical proficiency without unseemly displays of emotion. A proper young lady played to showcase her refinement, not her soul. And Georgiana had succeeded brilliantly at being proper, so brilliantly that she had forgotten how to be anything else. She did not hear the door open behind her, did not notice the tall figure that paused in the doorway, hesitant and uncertain. She did not see him take a step forward and then stop, clearly debating whether to intrude upon such raw privacy. She was lost in her grief, in the music that poured from her fingers with more honesty than anything she had played in years, in the tears that fell onto the dusty keys. And then suddenly there were other hands beside hers on the pianoforte, long fingers with a pianist's elegant shape, and a melody joined hers, weaving around the Chopin like a conversation, like a response to everything her playing was saying. The new melody was hauntingly beautiful, unfamiliar, filled with a melancholy that matched her own, but also held something else, something like understanding, like recognition. Georgiana's hands stilled in shock, and she turned to find Benedict Wentworth, Duke of Ashford, standing behind the bench, his dark eyes fixed on the keys as he continued to play. She had seen him only from a distance at various social functions over the years, always at the periphery, always leaving early, the subject of endless speculation and whispered gossip. Society called him the Ghost Duke, a man who had withdrawn from public life after some terrible scandal years ago, appearing only at the most important events, and then only briefly. He was tall and lean with dark hair that fell across his forehead, aristocratic features that might have been handsome, if not for the profound sadness that shadowed them, and hands that moved across the keys with the assured grace of someone for whom music was as natural as breathing. "Your Grace," Georgiana gasped, hastily trying to wipe her tears and restore some semblance of composure. Forgive me, I did not know anyone remained." She reached up to pin her fallen hair, suddenly acutely aware of how she must appear, dishevelled and tear-stained, nothing like the proper young lady who had performed in the drawing-room. But Benedict's hands did not leave the keys, continuing to play the mysterious melody that seemed to speak directly to her shattered heart. "Don't apologize for feeling what the rest of them have forgotten how to feel," he said quietly, his voice a deep baritone with a slight roughness, as if from disuse. "That song you played tonight was flawless, and utterly empty, just as they demanded it be." Georgiana felt heat rise to her cheeks, shame and something else mingling in her chest. "You heard them," she whispered. What they said about me? Benedict's eyes finally lifted from the keys to meet hers, and in the moonlight streaming through the windows, she saw that they were a deep grey, the colour of storm clouds, and filled with an understanding that made her breath catch. "I heard them say you lack passion," he replied. "They're fools. I heard something else entirely when you played a woman, trying desperately to break free from a cage of expectation." His words struck her with the force of recognition, as if he had reached into her chest and given voice to feelings she had never articulated even to herself. "How did you?" she began, but could not finish the question. Benedict's fingers moved through a particularly complex passage of the melody, and Georgiana found herself drawn into its beauty despite her confusion. "What is that piece you're playing?" she asked. "I've never heard it before." "The Caged Song," he replied, his expression distant as if lost in memory. "I wrote it years ago, during a period of profound isolation. I've never shared it with anyone." The revelation that he composed, that he was sharing something so personal with her, a virtual stranger, made Georgiana's heart race. "Why are you playing it for me?" she asked. "Because," Benedict said, his hands finally stilling on the keys as he turned to look at her fully, "you are the first person I've encountered in 7 years who understands what it means to be a prisoner of other people's expectations. The first person whose playing, however technically perfect, screamed with the same desperation I felt when I wrote this." They stood there in the abandoned music room, 2 people who moments before had been strangers, connected by music and shared understanding in a way that felt more intimate than anything Georgiana had experienced. The moonlight illuminated the dust and the shrouded furniture and the untouched memories, creating a world separate from the bright drawing room where society still gathered, where proprieties still ruled, where passion was something to be suppressed rather than celebrated. Benedict's presence beside her at the bench, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him, closer than any man had been to her outside of a formal dance, should have scandalized her. But instead, Georgiana felt something unfurling in her chest, something that had been tightly closed for so long she had forgotten its existence. Here in this forgotten room, with this mysterious, reclusive duke playing a song about cages and captivity, she felt for the first time in years the possibility that she might be something more than the perfect, passionless performance her father demanded and society expected. The proposal came as Benedict prepared to leave the music room that first night, his hand already on the door handle when he turned back to where Georgiana still sat at the pianoforte, her hair dishevelled and her face marked by tears that had begun to dry in silvery tracks down her cheeks. "Let me teach you," he said abruptly, the words seeming to surprise him as much as they did her. "Let me teach you to play with the feeling they say you lack, to make music that matters rather than music that merely satisfies expectation." Georgiana's heart lurched in her chest, torn immediately between the desperate hunger his offer awakened and the knowledge that what he proposed was impossible, improper, dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with physical safety and everything to do with the precarious position of an unmarried woman of 26, whose reputation was her only currency in society's marriage market. "I could not possibly," she began, but Benedict interrupted her with a shake of his head. "I will not re-enter society," he said firmly. "I cannot bear the scrutiny, the whispers, the eyes that follow me everywhere looking for signs of the monster they believe me to be. But here, in this forgotten room at midnight when the rest of the house sleeps, I could teach you what your mother knew, what you have buried so deep you've forgotten it exists. No one need know. You could tell your family you are practicing alone, working to improve your performance. And perhaps," he added more quietly. Perhaps in teaching you to feel again, I might remember how to do the same. The vulnerability in his voice, the admission that he too was trapped in a cage of his own making, decided her. Yes, Georgiana whispered, knowing even as she spoke that she was crossing a threshold from which there would be no easy return. Yes, I want to learn. And so began 3 weeks that would transform everything Georgiana thought she knew about music, about herself, about the careful boundaries she had constructed to survive in a world that demanded women be ornamental rather than authentic. That first lesson, she arrived at the music room precisely at midnight, her hair still pinned in the severe style she wore during the day, her posture rigid with nerves and the ingrained habits of propriety. Benedict was already there, having apparently entered through the garden door to avoid any possibility of being seen by servants in the main house, and he sat at the pianoforte playing a melody that filled the room with such longing that Georgiana felt it like a physical ache in her chest. He did not acknowledge her entrance immediately, lost in the music with his eyes closed, and she stood transfixed, watching him play with an abandon she had never witnessed, his whole body moving with the melody, surrendering to it rather than controlling it. When the last notes faded into silence, he opened his eyes and gestured for her to sit beside him on the bench. Music is not about the notes, Georgiana, he said without preamble. It is about the silence between them, the breath, the hesitation, the yearning. Everything you were taught about playing correctly, about maintaining proper tempo and observing every marking precisely, all of that is merely the foundation. But a house built only on foundation with no walls or roof is not a home, just as music played with only technical precision is not truly music at all. Georgiana felt something rebel in her chest at his words, even as she recognized their truth. My father says a woman's accomplishments must showcase refinement, not raw feeling, she replied, her voice small in the moonlit room. That passion is unseemly. Benedict turned to look at her fully, his grey eyes intense in the darkness. Your father is preparing you to be an ornament, not a woman, he said bluntly. There is a difference between what society calls accomplished and what it means to be truly alive. He reached out and took her hands in his, turning them over to examine her fingers, and the touch sent an unexpected shock through her system. You have the hands of a true musician, he said. Long fingers, strength in the joints, calluses from hours of practice. But you use them like tools to execute someone else's vision rather than instruments to express your own soul. Over the following nights, Benedict dismantled everything Georgiana had been taught about playing the pianoforte, replacing rigid rules with something far more terrifying and exhilarating. He made her play scales with her eyes closed, focusing not on perfect technique, but on the feeling of the keys beneath her fingers, the resonance of each note in her body. He demonstrated passages with such emotional intensity that Georgiana found herself weeping again, not from sorrow, but from the sheer beauty of music played as it was meant to be played, as a window into the human heart. He would stand behind her as she played, his hands hovering near her shoulders, and correct her posture, not by pulling her into rigidity, but by encouraging her to relax, to breathe, to let the music move through her rather than forcing it into submission. The first time his hands touched her waist to adjust how she sat at the bench, Georgiana gasped at the intimacy of it, but Benedict seemed unconscious of any impropriety, focused entirely on teaching her to embody the music rather than simply perform it. Play this passage again, he would say, and this time think of something that breaks your heart, something you have never allowed yourself to fully feel. And Georgiana would play, tentatively at first, and then with growing confidence, letting images of her mother fill her mind, letting the grief she had suppressed for 5 years pour through her fingers into the keys. "Better," Benedict would murmur, "but you are still holding back. Let go, Georgiana. Let yourself fall into it. Trust that the music will catch you." The music room began to transform along with Georgiana's playing. After the second lesson, she arrived early to light candles around the room, chasing away some of the darkness and creating pools of warm, golden light that softened the ghostly quality of the shrouded furniture. After the third lesson, she brought flowers from the garden, spring blooms that filled the air with fragrance and made the abandoned space feel less like a tomb and more like a sanctuary. By the second week, she had retrieved her mother's sheet music from storage, pieces her father had forbidden her to play because they required too much feeling, too much of the passion he had tried to crush in his wife, and she spread them across the pianoforte for Benedict to see. He examined them with reverence, his fingers tracing the notations in her mother's hand, and then he looked at Georgiana with new understanding in his eyes. "She was a true musician," he said softly. "You come by your gift honestly. It is in your blood, this need to make music that matters." As the lessons progressed, Benedict began to share pieces of his own story, revelations that came haltingly, as if each word cost him something. During the second week, as rain began to fall outside the windows in a soft spring shower that created a curtain of sound around their private world, Georgiana asked the question that had been building in her mind since that first night. "Why did you stop composing after she died?" The silence that followed was so long she thought he might not answer, but finally Benedict sat at the pianoforte and began to play, a melody so saturated with grief that it made the caged song seem almost hopeful by comparison. "Because every melody became a requiem," he said, his voice raw with honesty that felt like a gift. "I could not create beauty knowing I had destroyed it." Georgiana's hands stilled on her lap, her breath caught in her throat. "What happened?" she whispered. Benedict's fingers moved through the sorrowful melody as he spoke, as if he could only tell this story while the music gave him strength. "Her name was Clara," he said. "We married when I was 25 and she was 19. A love match rather than an arrangement, which was rare enough in our circles to be remarkable. She was gentle and kind and utterly unsuited to the demands of being a duchess. My estates required constant attention, social obligations were endless, and I, fool that I was, expected her to fulfill every duty without complaint. When she became pregnant, the doctors warned us that she had a weak constitution, that childbirth would be dangerous for her. But I was so desperate for an heir, so focused on securing the succession, that I did not protect her as I should have. I allowed her to continue attending functions, hosting dinners, traveling between estates, all while carrying our child. 7 years ago, she went into labor 2 months early. She labored for 3 days before—" He paused, his playing becoming almost violent, before both she and our son died. Society blamed me, said I had worked her to death in my ambition to produce an heir. And they were right. The melody dissolved into discord and then silence, and Benedict's hands fell from the keys as if they could no longer bear the weight of the notes. I killed them both through my negligence, my selfishness, my inability to see past duty to the person I claimed to love. Georgiana felt tears streaming down her face again. But this time they were for him, for the impossible burden of guilt he had carried alone for 7 years. "You did not kill them," she said fiercely. "You loved them. You made a mistake in judgment, perhaps, but you did not murder your wife and child. The doctors should have been more insistent. Your family should have intervened. Clara herself made choices about what she could endure. You cannot carry this guilt as if you were the only person involved in the tragedy." Benedict looked at her with such naked pain that she ached to comfort him. But she knew words would not be enough. So instead she placed her hands on the keys beside his and began to play one of her mother's pieces, a gentle melody that spoke of love and loss and the terrible beauty of grief. After a moment, Benedict joined her, their hands moving in tandem, creating harmonies that filled the candlelit room with something that felt like healing. As the third week began, Georgiana noticed changes in herself that went beyond her playing, though that too had transformed in ways that would have shocked anyone who heard her mechanical performances in the drawing room. Her hair had begun to loosen from its severe pins almost unconsciously during the lessons, falling in soft waves around her shoulders as she lost herself in the music. Her posture, once rigidly perfect, had softened into something more natural, more human. She found herself laughing during the lessons when Benedict would demonstrate an overly dramatic interpretation of a piece, or when her fingers would stumble over a particularly difficult passage, and he would tease her gently about being too much in her head. The formality that had characterized their first lesson had given way to an easy intimacy, a comfort with each other that felt both dangerously improper and absolutely right. One night during that third week, as rain fell more heavily outside the windows and wind howled around the corners of the house, Benedict stood behind Georgiana to correct her posture during a particularly emotional section of Chopin. His hands rested on her shoulders, then slid down to her waist, and when he leaned forward to speak quietly near her ear about feeling the music in her whole body rather than just her fingers, Georgiana became acutely aware of how close his face was to hers, how she could feel his breath warm against her neck, how her heart was racing with something that had nothing to do with the music and everything to do with the man touching her. She turned her head slightly and found his face mere inches from her own, his grey eyes dark and intense in the candlelight, and for a breathless moment she thought he might kiss her. But instead he stepped back abruptly, clearing his throat and moving to the other side of the pianoforte, as if putting distance between them, and Georgiana felt the loss of his warmth like a physical ache. During that same week, Georgiana finally shared her own tragedy with him, the story she had never told anyone in its full truth. "My mother was brilliant," she said as they sat side by side on the bench after a particularly exhausting lesson. She played with such passion that audiences would weep, would stand and applaud until their hands were sore. She could have been one of the great musicians of her generation if she had been born a man, or born to a different family, or lived in a different time. But my father married her for her beauty and her connections, and when he discovered that she cared more for music than for hosting perfect dinner parties, he forbade her from performing publicly. He said it was unseemly for a woman of her station to display such emotion, that she was embarrassing the family with her excess of feeling. So she stopped performing, stopped playing anything but the most acceptable pieces in the most acceptable manner, and something in her died. She grew thin and pale, lost interest in everything, stopped smiling. The doctors called it a decline, as if she were suffering from some mysterious illness, but I knew the truth. She died of suppression, of having her spirit crushed under the weight of propriety and expectation. And I have spent the last 5 years trying to honor her by being the proper daughter my father wanted her to be. But I see now that I have only been repeating the same tragedy, killing my own spirit in the name of respectability. Benedict took her hand in his, a gesture that had become natural between them over the weeks of lessons, and brought it to his lips in a kiss that was somehow both chaste and deeply intimate. "Then we shall resurrect both your spirits," he said softly, "hers through you learning to play as she once did, and yours by refusing to accept the cage they have built around you." The music they created together, In that third week transcended anything Georgiana had thought possible, melodies that seemed to weave their two stories together into something larger than either tragedy alone. They played duets where their hands would cross and tangle on the keys, where the music required them to lean against each other for balance, where the physical closeness matched the emotional intimacy that had grown between them. Benedict taught her to improvise, to let her fingers find melodies without the constraint of sheet music, and Georgiana discovered a joy in musical creation that she had never imagined existed. She began arriving at the music room earlier each night and leaving later, stretching their time together until dawn threatened, and they were forced to part before the household began to wake. The servants surely noticed that Georgiana looked exhausted each morning, that she slept late and moved through her days in a dreamy haze. But she told her father that she was practicing diligently to improve her performance, and he seemed satisfied with this explanation, pleased that his daughter was finally taking her accomplishments seriously. Lydia eyed her sister with suspicion, noting the change in Georgiana's demeanor, the way she seemed to glow despite her fatigue. But Georgiana deflected all questions with vague references to the satisfaction of musical improvement. By the end of the third week, something had shifted between Benedict and Georgiana that went beyond teacher and student, beyond the shared understanding of grief, beyond even the growing attraction that made her pulse race whenever he touched her to correct her playing. They had created a world in the music room that existed outside of time and society's rules, a space where they could be authentic in ways impossible anywhere else. But both of them knew, though neither spoke it aloud, that such a world could not remain separate forever, that eventually the dawn would come, not just literally, but metaphorically, forcing them to reconcile the intimacy they had built in secret with the impossible realities of their public lives. And now's the time to stop and subscribe to our channel. Every subscriber brings us closer to 1,000, which helps us keep these stories alive and coming your way. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how far these tales travel across the world. Now let's continue. Georgiana should have known that secrets kept in candlelight cannot survive the harsh exposure of daylight, but she had been so lost in the private world she and Benedict had created that she failed to notice the signs of discovery until it was far too late. Lydia had been watching her elder sister with growing suspicion throughout those 3 weeks, noting how Georgiana would slip away each night, claiming exhaustion only to appear at breakfast looking more tired than before, how she moved through her days with a distracted air, as if her mind existed somewhere else entirely, how she had begun to glow with something that looked dangerously like happiness, despite her supposed dedication to solitary practice. The younger Dashwood sister, accustomed to being the center of attention with her golden curls and effortless charm, had watched Georgiana's transformation with a mixture of curiosity and resentment that finally drove her to follow her sister one midnight to discover the source of this change. What Lydia witnessed through the crack in the music room door, Georgiana playing a passionate duet with the reclusive Duke of Ashford, while he stood behind her with his hands on her waist and his face close to her neck, was shocking enough to send her racing to their father's study, despite the late hour. Lord Edmund Dashwood's rage upon hearing his eldest daughter described in such a compromising position with a man, let alone the ghost duke whose wife had died under circumstances that remained the subject of endless speculation, was a terrible thing to behold. He confronted Georgiana the next morning before she had fully woken from the few hours of sleep she had managed after her lesson with Benedict, dragging her from her bed and demanding to know if Lydia's account was true. Georgiana, still muzzy with exhaustion and caught completely unprepared, could not deny what her sister had seen, though she tried desperately to explain that the lessons were innocent, that Benedict had been teaching her to play with genuine feeling, that nothing improper had occurred despite the late hours and intimate setting. Her father's hand connected with her cheek hard enough to snap her head to the side, the first time he had struck her since childhood, and his voice shook with fury as he told her she had disgraced the family name, destroyed her reputation, and left him no choice but to arrange an immediate marriage to salvage what little respectability remained. For 3 days, Georgiana was kept confined to her room while her father made arrangements, forbidden from leaving or receiving visitors, forced to endure Lydia's tearful apologies through the locked door and her own growing panic about what was happening beyond her reach. She had no way to contact Benedict, no way to warn him or explain, no way to do anything but wait as her father constructed the cage that would trap her forever. On the 4th day, a maid came to dress her in her finest afternoon gown and informed her that she would be attending Lady Henrietta Morland's garden party, that her father had important announcements to make, that she should compose herself and remember her duty to the family. The garden party was already well underway when the Dashwood family arrived at the Morland estate, the manicured lawns filled with London's most influential families enjoying the unseasonably warm May afternoon. Roses bloomed in glorious profusion, their heavy scent almost cloying in the still air, and champagne flowed freely as ladies in pastel gowns and gentlemen in dark coats moved between the refreshment tables and the white pavilion that had been erected near the ornamental pond. Georgiana felt the sunlight as an assault after days in her darkened room, the brightness making her head ache, the crowds of people pressing in from all sides making it difficult to breathe. She moved beside her father in a daze, barely registering the curious stares that followed them, the whispers that began immediately upon their arrival. Lord Dashwood had clearly been busy during her confinement, spreading some version of events that painted him as the concerned father protecting his wayward daughter, and Georgiana could see the speculation in every eye that turned toward her. Beside her, father walked Mr. Charles Tilney, a wealthy merchant who had made his fortune in textiles and was now attempting to purchase his way into higher society through strategic alliances with impoverished aristocratic families. He was perhaps 45 years old, portly and red-faced, with mutton-chop whiskers and an air of self-satisfaction that radiated from him like heat. Georgiana had met him only twice before at various functions, and both times had found him pompous and condescending, the sort of man who spoke to women as if they were particularly slow children, requiring patient explanation of the simplest concepts. The realization that this was the man her father intended her to marry made Georgiana's stomach turn with nausea, but before she could fully process the horror of her situation, Lord Dashwood had guided her to the centre of the lawn where Lady Morland stood holding court among the most influential matrons of London society. With a voice pitched to carry across the garden, ensuring every guest would hear his announcement, Lord Dashwood declared that he had the great pleasure of sharing wonderful news with his dear friends. His eldest daughter, Georgiana, had accepted the proposal of Mr. Charles Tilney, and they would be married within the month, in a quiet ceremony befitting a woman of her age and circumstances. The emphasis he placed on those last words made clear that Georgiana's unmarried status at 26 was a source of embarrassment, that she should be grateful for any offer, regardless of the source. The assembled guests responded with polite congratulations that barely masked their surprised speculation, fans fluttering as whispers were exchanged behind gloved hands. Georgiana stood frozen beside her father, his hand gripped around her arm tightly enough that she knew bruises would bloom there later, and felt the world tilting around her as if the ground had become unstable beneath her feet. This could not be happening. She could not marry Charles Tilney. She could not spend the rest of her life as the possession of a man who saw her as an acquisition rather than a person, who would demand the same mechanical perfection her father had always required, who would never understand the music that lived in her soul or the transformation she had undergone in those 3 weeks of midnight lessons. But before she could find her voice to protest, to refuse, to do anything but stand there in mute horror, a familiar deep voice spoke from the edge of the gathering. "Lord Dashwood, I must beg a word with you regarding this announcement." Every head turned toward the speaker, and Georgiana felt her heart stop completely as she recognized Benedict Wentworth, Duke of Ashford, standing at the periphery of the garden party in formal afternoon dress, his dark hair slightly dishevelled, as if he had ridden hard to arrive here, his grey eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her knees weak. The gasps that rippled through the crowd were audible, fans snapping open with sharp cracks as every woman present turned to her neighbour to confirm that was indeed the ghost Duke, making his first public appearance in 7 years at a garden party. And yes, he appeared to be involving himself in the Dashwood situation, and oh, how deliciously scandalous this was becoming. Benedict moved through the crowd with the unconscious authority of a man born to command. Ignoring the stares and whispers, his attention focused entirely on Lord Dashwood, who had gone rigid with fury beside Georgiana. "Your Grace," Lord Dashwood said through clenched teeth, "this is a private family matter that does not concern you. I must ask you to leave before you cause further disruption." Benedict stopped a few feet away, close enough that Georgiana could see the determination in his face, the slight trembling in his hands that betrayed how much this public appearance was costing him. "On the contrary," he said clearly, "it concerns me greatly. Miss Dashwood has been my student for the past 3 weeks, learning musicianship in the estate's music room with my instruction. If there are questions about propriety, I am prepared to address them directly." The crowd's whispers grew louder, more excited, as the scandal they had suspected was now confirmed by the Duke himself. Lady Henrietta Morland stepped forward, her face alight with malicious pleasure, barely concealed behind a mask of concern. "Your Grace," she said sweetly, "are you truly admitting to clandestine meetings with an unmarried woman? Alone, at midnight, in a private room? Surely you understand how such behavior appears, especially given your history." The pointed reference to Clara's death made Benedict flinch, but he held his ground. "Lord Dashwood, your daughter is the most honourable woman I have ever known. If there is blame for any impropriety, it rests solely with me. I proposed the lessons, I insisted on their private nature, due to my reluctance to re-enter society. I placed her in a position that could be misconstrued. She is entirely blameless in this matter." Lord Dashwood's face had turned an alarming shade of purple, and his grip on Georgiana's arm tightened painfully. "You have disgraced this family," he hissed at her before turning his fury on Benedict. "Alone with a man whose own wife could not survive his demands, whose household is marked by death and tragedy, and you claim she is blameless. She has destroyed her reputation through this association, and you dare to come here and speak of honor?" Benedict's expression hardened, pain flashing across his features at the accusation that struck at his deepest wound. "My wife's death was a tragedy," he said quietly, "but it was not the result of my demands. She had a congenital heart condition that made pregnancy dangerous. She chose to attempt motherhood against medical advice because she wanted to give me an heir. I carry the grief of her loss every day, but I will not allow you to use her memory as a weapon against your daughter who has done nothing wrong." The revelation about Clara's heart condition caused another ripple of whispers, some guests looking uncomfortable at Lord Dashwood's harsh accusations, while others seemed disappointed that the scandal was less dramatic than they had hoped. But Lady Morland was not finished, her voice cutting through the murmurs with practiced precision. "Your Grace," she said, her tone dripping with false sympathy, "your very presence is a stain. First one woman dies in your care, and now you pursue another. Have you no shame? You have lived as a ghost for 7 years, and perhaps that is what you should have remained, rather than emerging to corrupt another innocent woman with your attentions. Benedict's face went white at her words, and Georgiana saw him sway slightly, as if physically struck by the cruelty of the accusation. She knew in that moment exactly what he was thinking, could see the guilt and self-loathing rising in his eyes, could feel him beginning to believe what they were saying, that he truly did destroy everything he loved, that his very presence brought harm to those around him. The crowd was watching now with avid attention, champagne glasses forgotten in hands, as they witnessed the Duke being publicly eviscerated, and Georgiana realized with dawning horror that Benedict's attempt to defend her honor had only made everything worse. His appearance here had confirmed every suspicion, given weight to every whispered accusation, turned what might have been dismissed as innocent, if improper lessons, into something that looked like a scandalous affair. If she did not act now, Benedict would be destroyed along with her reputation, blamed for corrupting her, just as society had blamed him for Clara's death, forced to retreat even further from the world until he disappeared entirely into his grief and isolation. And so Georgiana made the choice that shattered both their hearts, the choice to protect him, even if it meant lying about everything they had shared, even if it meant denying the transformation he had sparked in her, even if it meant accepting the cage she had been trying so desperately to escape. She pulled her arm free from her father's grip and stepped forward, her voice carrying across the silent garden as every guest strained to hear what she would say. "Please, everyone, you misunderstand," she said, and she was proud that her voice remained steady, even as her heart broke into pieces. His Grace was merely instructing me in technique, helping me improve my performance on the pianoforte. There is no attachment between us. There never was. I am grateful for his instruction, but my affections, such as they are, belong entirely to Mr. Tilney, with whom I am honored to be engaged. The lie tasted like ash in her mouth, and she forced herself to look at Benedict as she spoke it, needing him to see the truth in her eyes, even as her words denied it, needing him to understand that she was doing this to save him from further scandal. But what she saw in his face made her want to take back every word. He looked devastated, completely shattered, his grey eyes wide with a pain so profound it was almost unbearable to witness. For a long moment, he simply stared at her, as if trying to reconcile the woman who had played music with such passion in the candlelit intimacy of the music room with this stranger who stood in the harsh sunlight denying everything they had shared. Then something changed in his expression, the devastation carefully masked behind a veneer of aristocratic composure, and he inclined his head in a bow that somehow conveyed both respect and utter defeat. "Of course," he said quietly, his voice rough, with emotion he was struggling to contain. "Forgive my presumption, Miss Dashwood. I wish you every happiness in your marriage." He turned and walked away without another word, his back straight and his pace measured, despite what must have been an overwhelming urge to flee. The crowd parted before him in silence, no one quite meeting his eyes, and Georgiana watched him disappear toward the carriages with a sense of loss so profound it made her previous grief over her mother seem almost bearable by comparison. She had just destroyed the only person who had ever truly understood her, had confirmed his worst belief about himself, had chosen duty and propriety over authentic love exactly as her mother had done. Benedict's elegant black carriage pulled away down the tree-lined drive, taking with it any possibility of the future she had begun to imagine during those midnight lessons. And Georgiana felt something inside her die just as surely as her mother's spirit had died under the weight of suppression and expectation. Lord Dashwood reclaimed his grip on her arm, satisfaction evident in his posture as he accepted congratulations from guests who were already spinning the encounter into gossip they would share at tomorrow's calls and evening events. Mr. Tilney appeared at her other side, pompously declaring that he was glad that unfortunate misunderstanding had been cleared up, that he had never doubted her virtue, that she would make a fine wife once she learned to be more circumspect in her behavior. Lydia stood nearby, her face uncertain as she watched her sister being led away toward the refreshment pavilion, the smug satisfaction she had felt upon revealing Georgiana's secret transforming into something like guilt as she witnessed the genuine anguish in her sister's eyes. Lady Morland and the other matrons clustered together, fans moving rapidly as they dissected every word and gesture, already determining which version of events would become the official story told in drawing rooms across London. The garden party continued around Georgiana as if nothing momentous had occurred, as if her entire world had not just collapsed in the space of a few devastating minutes. The roses continued to bloom with sickening sweetness, the champagne continued to flow, the sun continued to shine with oppressive brightness on the manicured lawns and elegant guests. But for Georgiana, the light had become darkness, the music in her soul had fallen silent, and the cage she had briefly escaped had locked around her more firmly than ever before. That night, she did not go to the music room at midnight. For the first time in 3 weeks, the candles remained unlit, the pianoforte untouched, the space empty of everything except dust and memories, and the ghost of what might have been if she had chosen differently, if she had been braver, if society had been kinder. Benedict did not come either, and Georgiana knew with terrible certainty that he never would again, that she had succeeded in her goal of protecting him from further scandal by destroying any possibility of connection between them. She had saved his reputation by breaking his heart, had chosen duty over love exactly as her father had always intended, and the victory tasted like the defeat it truly was. The wedding preparations began in earnest the next day, Lord Dashwood determined to see his daughter safely married before any other complications could arise. Charles Tilney was given permission to call daily, his pompous pronouncements about how he would manage his wife filling the drawing room as Georgiana sat in silent misery. The music room remained locked and dark, a tomb for dreams that had died before they could fully form, and Georgiana moved through her days like one already dead, performing the role of grateful bride-to-be, while inside she screamed with the agony of authentic feeling she could no longer express. Society had won, propriety had triumphed, and the music that had briefly returned to Georgiana's soul had been silenced perhaps forever. 5 weeks passed like a slow death, each day blurring into the next, as Georgiana moved through her life with the mechanical precision she had once brought to her pianoforte performances, executing every required action with flawless technique and absolutely no feeling whatsoever. The wedding preparations consumed the household with relentless momentum, an unstoppable force that swept her along like driftwood caught in a current, and she found herself standing for dress fittings while seamstresses pinned white silk around her body as if preparing a corpse for burial, nodding absently as her father's housekeeper presented linens and household items for her trousseau, accepting congratulations from callers with a smile that felt painted onto her face and words of gratitude that tasted like dust in her mouth. Lord Dashwood was enormously satisfied with himself, convinced that he had saved his daughter from ruin and secured her future with a wealthy if common husband who would provide material comfort even if he lacked aristocratic breeding, and he moved through the house with an air of accomplishment that made Georgiana want to scream every time she encountered him. Charles Tilney called daily, as was his right as her betrothed, and each visit was an exercise in endurance as he held forth on his plans for their future, discussing the improvements he would make to his London townhouse to accommodate his wife, the entertainments he would permit her to attend, and those he would forbid as unsuitable, the manner in which she would manage his household and present herself in society as Mrs. Tilney rather than Miss Dashwood. He spoke of her as one might speak of a newly acquired piece of property, valuable certainly, but requiring proper management and control. And Georgiana sat in the drawing-room listening to him pontificate, while her mind existed somewhere else entirely, somewhere dark and silent and far from the suffocating present. She had not touched a piano since the garden party, could not bear to even enter a room where such an instrument resided, and when her father suggested she should practice so that she might perform for Charles's business associates after their marriage, she had looked at him with such hollow emptiness that even he, oblivious as he was to her suffering, had fallen silent and not raised the subject again. The music room in the West Wing remained locked and abandoned, dust gathering once more on surfaces she had so carefully cleaned during those 3 weeks that now seemed like a dream or perhaps a cruel hallucination, and Georgiana avoided that corridor entirely, as if the room itself might accuse her of cowardice for the choice she had made. Lydia had attempted several times to speak with her sister, arriving at Georgiana's door with tear-stained apologies and explanations about how she had not understood what she was doing, how she had been jealous and petty, and had not imagined such terrible consequences would follow her revelation. But Georgiana was too hollowed out to respond to these overtures with anything beyond a nod of acknowledgement that she had heard the words, even if they meant nothing to her any more. Benedict had disappeared entirely from London, his townhouse shuttered and his servants dismissed or reassigned to his country estates, and the gossip that had consumed drawing-rooms for weeks after the garden party had gradually faded as newer scandals emerged to capture society's fickle attention. Some said the Duke had fled to his holdings in Derbyshire, others whispered he had left England altogether for the continent. A few cruel voices suggested he had perhaps done away with himself, as his guilt over destroying another woman finally became unbearable, but no one knew for certain where he had gone or whether he would ever return. Georgiana told herself she was glad he had escaped, that her lie had succeeded in protecting him from further scandal, that his absence proved she had made the right choice even as the emptiness inside her grew larger with each passing day. She did not allow herself to think about the music they had created together, the way his hands had guided hers on the keys, the sound of his voice in the candle-lit darkness, teaching her to feel rather than merely perform, the moment when his face had been inches from hers, and she had thought he might kiss her. Those memories belonged to someone else, to a Georgiana who had briefly believed she could choose authenticity over expectation, and that woman had died in Lady Morland's garden alongside any possibility of genuine happiness. The wedding was set for the 15th of June, a date that approached with inexorable certainty, and as the final week arrived, Georgiana found herself unable to sleep at night, lying in her bed staring at the ceiling while the house settled into silence around her, and her mind replayed endlessly the look on Benedict's face when she had denied any attachment between them. 3 days before the wedding, when the dress hung in her wardrobe like a white ghost awaiting its opportunity to possess her completely, when the final preparations had reached a fever pitch of activity throughout the household, when Georgiana had resigned herself to the fate she had chosen and was simply waiting for the ceremony that would seal it permanently, her elderly aunt arrived for an unexpected visit. Lady Beatrice Gardiner was her mother's eldest sister, a formidable woman of 73 years who had been widowed young and had never remarried despite numerous offers, living instead on her late husband's estate in Kent, where she devoted herself to managing her lands with shrewd competence and maintaining an extensive correspondence with artists and musicians across Europe. She had always been Georgiana's favorite relation, one of the few family members who had understood and encouraged her mother's passion for music, and her visits were rare enough that her appearance in the Dashwood drawing-room 3 days before the wedding caused considerable surprise. Lord Dashwood greeted his sister-in-law with barely concealed irritation at the disruption to his careful schedule, but even he could not refuse her request for private time with her niece, and so Georgiana found herself being led upstairs to her own bedchamber, with Aunt Beatrice's surprisingly strong hand gripping her elbow. The moment the door closed behind them, Aunt Beatrice fixed Georgiana with a penetrating stare that seemed to see through every defense she had constructed over the past 5 weeks. "You look half dead, child," the old woman said bluntly, settling herself into the chair by the window with a rustle of dark silk skirts. "When I heard about this wedding, I told myself it could not possibly be true, that you would never willingly chain yourself to that pompous fool Tilney. But looking at you now, I see you have indeed made that choice, though whether it was truly willing is another question entirely." Georgiana sank onto the edge of her bed, too exhausted to maintain pretense with the one person who had always seen her clearly. "What does it matter whether it was willing or not?" she said dully. "It is done. The wedding is in 3 days. There is no point in discussing alternatives that do not exist." Aunt Beatrice reached into the large reticule she carried and withdrew a package wrapped in brown paper and tied with string, placing it on the small table beside her chair. "This arrived at my home 2 weeks ago," she said. "It was addressed to you but sent to my residence, presumably because the sender knew your father would intercept anything delivered here directly. I have been debating whether to bring it to you or whether doing so would be a cruelty, but having seen your face, I have decided that cruelty might be kinder than allowing you to proceed in ignorance of what you are giving up." Georgiana stared attired, the package with a mixture of dread and desperate hope that made her hands tremble. "Who sent it?" she whispered, though she already knew the answer, could feel the truth of it in the way her heart had begun to race for the first time in weeks. Aunt Beatrice's expression softened. "The Duke of Ashford," she replied. "I have been watching you, child, more carefully than you knew. I saw how you changed during those weeks of midnight lessons, saw the life return to your eyes and the music return to your soul. I also saw what it cost you to deny that connection in Lady Morland's garden, and I have been grieving for you ever since." Georgiana reached for the package with shaking hands, her fingers fumbling with the string until Aunt Beatrice rose to help her, cutting through the bindings with a small knife from her reticule and stepping back to give her niece privacy to examine the contents. Inside the wrapping was sheet music, pages and pages of original composition in Benedict's distinctive hand, the notes flowing across the staves with the same elegant precision she remembered from the pieces he had shared during their lessons. The title at the top of the first page made her breath catch in her throat. Georgiana's Song, written in his careful script, and beneath it a dedication that blurred as tears filled her eyes for the first time since the garden party. "For the woman who taught me that music and life both require the courage to feel." Beneath the sheet music was a folded letter, and Georgiana opened it with trembling fingers to find Benedict's words covering both sides of the page in the same elegant handwriting. "Miss Dashwood," the letter began with painful formality, "I hope you will forgive this presumption, but I find I cannot leave England for the continent as I had planned without first attempting to give you what I could not say aloud in Lady Morland's garden. This composition contains everything I have felt these past weeks, everything I should have spoken before it was too late, everything I will carry with me wherever I go. I do not send this with any expectation or demand. I know you have made your choice, and I respect it even as it has shattered me. But I needed you to know that what we shared in those midnight hours was real, at least for me, and that your lie in the garden, while I understand why you spoke it, could not erase the truth of what I feel. You asked me once why I stopped composing after Clara died, and I told you it was because every melody became a requiem. But this piece, this song I have written for you, is not a requiem. It is a testament to the possibility of living again after believing oneself dead, of feeling again after years of numbness, of hoping again after loss had made hope seem impossible. You gave me that gift in 3 short weeks, and I will be grateful for it, even as I mourn what might have been if circumstances had been different, if I were not the cursed duke, whose very presence brings scandal, if you were, free to choose without the weight of duty and expectation crushing every authentic impulse. I leave for Italy tomorrow, unable to remain in England, knowing you will marry another, knowing I will never again hear you play with the passion you discovered during our lessons, knowing the music room will remain forever sullant of the melodies we created together. But before I go, I wanted you to have this song, this piece of my heart translated into notation, this proof that you mattered, that what we shared mattered, that some connections transcend the boundaries society attempts to impose. The ending is unresolved because I could not presume to write your conclusion for you. Whatever future you choose, whatever life you build with Mr. Tilney or anyone else, I hope you will remember that you deserve to live authentically rather than merely exist properly. Choose yourself, Georgiana. Always. The letter was signed simply Benedict, no title or formality, just his name in the same intimate way he had spoken to her during their lessons, and tucked into the final page of the sheet music was a pressed flower, one of the blooms she had brought to the music room during their 2nd week together, preserved carefully between thin paper. Georgiana clutched the letter and the music to her chest as tears finally came, 5 weeks of suppressed grief and loss and longing pouring out in great wrenching sobs that shook her entire body. Aunt Beatrice moved to sit beside her on the bed, gathering her niece into her arms and holding her as she wept, stroking her hair and making soft, soothing sounds until the worst of the storm had passed. I was 19 when I chose duty over the man I loved, Aunt Beatrice said quietly, when Georgiana's sobs had subsided to hiccuping gasps. My parents had arranged my marriage to Lord Gardner, a good man, but not the one who held my heart, and I convinced myself that doing my duty was more important than following my feelings. I married Gardner and lived with him for 3 years before he died of a fever, and I have been alone for 51 years since, and I have regretted my choice every single day. Don't become me, child. Don't wake up at 73 years old realizing you have spent your entire life living half alive because you were too afraid to choose yourself. Georgiana pulled back to look at her aunt through tear-swollen eyes. It's too late, she said, her voice hollow with despair. The wedding is in 3 days. The invitations are sent. Father has already received the settlement from Charles. The contracts are signed. Even if I wanted to refuse, which I do, there is no way to extricate myself without destroying what little reputation I have left and bringing complete disgrace upon the family. Aunt Beatrice took Georgiana's face between her weathered hands, her grip firm and her gaze fierce. It is never too late to choose yourself, she said with absolute conviction. Society will recover. They always do. Some new scandal will emerge within a fortnight, and everyone will forget about the Dashwood girl who jilted her merchant fiancé. But you, child, will you recover from a lifetime of living half alive? Will you survive watching your spirit die the same way your mother's did, crushed under the weight of propriety and expectation? Because that is what awaits you if you marry Charles Tilney. I have seen his kind before, men who view their wives as possessions to be managed and controlled, and you will spend the rest of your days performing the role of the perfect wife, while the real you, the woman who plays music with such passion it makes listeners weep, slowly suffocates. Georgiana looked down at the sheet music in her lap, at the title that proclaimed her importance to the man who had written it, at the notes that represented everything she had thought lost forever. "He wrote me a song," she whispered. "A whole composition. How can I marry Charles when Benedict has given me this?" "Then don't," Aunt Beatrice said simply. "Choose differently. Choose yourself. Choose the possibility of authentic happiness over the certainty of respectable misery." After her aunt left with promises to return the following day, Georgiana sat alone in her bedchamber as afternoon faded into evening and evening into night, holding the sheet music and reading through the composition with growing wonder at its complexity and beauty. She could hear the melody in her mind even without playing it, could sense the emotional journey Benedict had crafted from sorrow through longing to something that felt like tentative joy. And as the house settled into silence around her and midnight approached, she found herself drawn inexorably toward the west wing and the abandoned music room she had been avoiding for 5 weeks. The door creaked as she pushed it open, and moonlight streamed through the windows, illuminating dust that had settled once again over every surface, thicker now than it had been before their lessons, as if the room itself was trying to bury the memory of what had happened within its walls. The pianoforte stood silent and reproachful, and Georgiana approached it slowly, placing the sheet music on the stand and lighting the candles she found still sitting where she had left them weeks ago. Her fingers trembled as she placed them on the keys, and the first notes that emerged were discordant, uncertain, her technique rusty from weeks of refusing to play. But as she worked through the opening measures of Georgiana's song, as the melody began to flow and the harmonies revealed themselves, something inside her began to wake from the numbness that had consumed her since the garden party. The composition was extraordinary, far more complex than anything Benedict had shared during their lessons, and as she played, Georgiana began to notice patterns in the notation, recurring sequences that seemed almost deliberate in their repetition. She stopped and examined the music more closely, studying the way certain notes appeared again and again in specific arrangements, and suddenly she saw it, the cipher hidden within the composition itself. Benedict had encoded a message into the very structure of the music, using a system where each note corresponded to a letter, and as she worked through the pattern with growing excitement, 3 words emerged with perfect clarity. "I love you." He had written his love into every measure, had crafted a musical declaration that only someone who understood his compositional style would recognize, had given her something far more profound than any spoken confession could have been. Georgiana played through the entire piece, tears streaming down her face as the music swelled from melancholy opening through passionate middle section to a climax that felt like triumph, like breaking free, like choosing life over mere existence. And then she reached the final page and the unresolved chord that hung in the air, waiting for completion, waiting for an answer she had not yet given. In the margin beside that unfinished ending, Benedict had written in his careful hand a final instruction. "The ending is yours to compose." She sat at the pianoforte in the candlelit music room as summer gave way to autumn outside the windows, leaves beginning to fall from the trees in the garden, and a chill creeping into the night air that spoke of changing seasons and changing times. And she understood with sudden clarity what Benedict was offering her. Not just his love, though that was written into every note and every word, but agency, choice, the power to determine her own ending rather than accepting the one others had written for her. He had left the composition unresolved because the resolution belonged to her alone, just as her life belonged to her alone, despite her father's plans and society's expectations, and the wedding that loomed 3 days hence. Georgiana played the unresolved chord again, letting it hang in the air, feeling the tension of incompletion, understanding that this moment, this choice, would determine everything that followed. She could accept the ending her father had written, marry Charles Tilney in 3 days, spend the rest of her life performing the role of dutiful wife, while her spirit slowly died as her mother's had. Or she could compose her own ending, resolve the chord in a way that felt true to the melody that had come before, choose the risky and scandalous path toward authentic happiness, rather than the safe road to respectable misery. The wedding dress hung in her wardrobe like a ghost waiting to possess her, white silk and lace that represented everything expected and proper and dead. But here in the music room, surrounded by candles and moonlight, and the echo of the melody Benedict had written for her, Georgiana felt the stirrings of something she had thought lost forever. Not just love, though she recognized now that what she felt for Benedict was indeed love in its truest and most terrifying form, but something even more fundamental, the will to live rather than merely exist, to feel rather than perform, to choose herself as Benedict had urged her to do in his final words. She placed her fingers on the keys once more and began to improvise an ending to the composition, letting her instincts guide her through modulations and progressions that felt right, even if they violated every rule she had been taught about proper musical structure. The resolution she created was triumphant, bold, a major chord that sang with possibility and hope, and the courage required to step into an uncertain future. It was not the ending anyone would have expected, but it was hers, composed from her own heart rather than inherited from someone else's vision of what her life should be. And as the final notes faded into silence, Georgiana Dashwood knew with absolute certainty what she had to do. The morning of the 15th of June dawned bright and cloudless, the kind of perfect summer day that seemed designed specifically for weddings, and Georgiana stood in her bedchamber, surrounded by maids fussing over the final details of her appearance, while her heart beat a rhythm that had nothing to do with bridal excitement and everything to do with the decision she had made 3 nights ago in the music room. The white silk gown had been laced and buttoned around her body with meticulous care, each tiny pearl button fastened by fingers more steady than her own, and the veil of Brussels lace had been arranged over her carefully dressed hair by the most fashionable modiste in London, creating an effect that was undeniably beautiful and utterly lifeless, a perfect bride prepared for sacrifice rather than celebration. Georgiana looked at herself in the full-length mirror and saw a stranger, a woman dressed for a role she no longer intended to play, and the knowledge of what she was about to do sent alternating waves of terror and exhilaration through her body until she felt almost dizzy with the intensity of conflicting emotions. Lydia had come to her room earlier, tearful and apologetic, begging forgiveness one final time for the revelation that had set all these terrible events in motion, and Georgiana had surprised both of them by embracing her sister and whispering that perhaps what had seemed like betrayal was actually the catalyst that would save her life. The confusion on Lydia's face suggested she did not understand, but there was no time to explain, and within moments the younger girl had been swept away by their governess to prepare for her own role in the ceremony. Aunt Beatrice had arrived at the house before dawn, ostensibly to help with final preparations, but actually to ensure that Georgiana had not lost her nerve during the 3 days since their conversation, and the fierce approval in the old woman's eyes when she examined her niece's resolute expression communicated more than words ever could. Lord Dashwood was in ebullient spirits, greeting guests as they arrived and accepting congratulations on the excellent match he had secured for his difficult eldest daughter, apparently viewing the wedding as a personal triumph that reflected well on his skills as a father and head of household. Charles Tilney had sent a note earlier that morning, expressing his satisfaction that his bride would soon be his to command, the phrasing so possessive and condescending that Georgiana had nearly laughed at the absurdity of ever having considered accepting such a future. The carriages arrived precisely on schedule, and Georgiana found herself being handed into the lead vehicle with her father, the short journey to St. George's Church in Hanover Square, passing in a blur of familiar London streets that suddenly seemed strange and distant, as if she were observing them from very far away. The church loomed ahead, its classical facade bright in the morning sun, and as they pulled up to the entrance, Georgiana could see the crowd of guests already assembled inside. London's finest families gathered to witness the marriage of Miss Dashwood to Mr. Tilney, and to dissect every detail for later discussion over tea and cards. Lord Dashwood helped her from the carriage with more gentleness than he had shown in weeks, perhaps feeling some paternal sentiment on this day when he would formally transfer responsibility for his daughter to another man, and they stood together in the vestibule while the ushers ensured all guests were properly seated and the ceremony could begin. Through the open doors, Georgiana could see Charles Tilney standing at the altar, his rotund figure stuffed into formal dress that strained at the seams, his face bearing an expression of smug satisfaction that made her stomach turn. Beside him stood his brother as groomsman, and along the front pews sat his business associates and their wives, people Georgiana did not know and had no desire to know, strangers who would become her social circle once she became Miss Tilney. On the other side of the aisle sat the Dashwood family connections, acquaintances from years of London seasons, society figures who had come more for the spectacle than from any genuine affection, and somewhere among them Aunt Beatrice, positioned strategically near the door in a location that seemed chosen for ease of exit rather than prominence of view. The organ began to play the processional, the familiar melody that had accompanied countless brides down countless aisles toward futures both happy and miserable, and Lord Dashwood took Georgiana's arm in his, preparing to lead her forward into the life he had chosen for her. She took one step, then another, moving through the doors and into the church proper, where every face turned toward her with expressions ranging from approval to envy to barely concealed pity. The aisle stretched before her like a tunnel, or perhaps a throat preparing to swallow her whole, and with each step forward, Georgiana felt the walls closing in, felt the weight of expectation pressing down from all sides, felt herself shrinking into the small, confined space society had designated as appropriate for women of her class and situation. Every face she passed represented another bar in the cage, every smile another lock clicking shut, every nod of approval another chain wrapping around her spirit. Halfway down the aisle, precisely at the point where tradition dictated she should be fully committed to forward motion with no possibility of retreat, Georgiana stopped walking. Lord Dashwood, caught mid-stride, stumbled slightly and turned to his daughter with confusion that quickly transformed into alarm as he registered the expression on her face. The organ continued playing for several measures before the organist realized something was wrong and the music stuttered to a halt, leaving the church in sudden, shocked silence. Every guest leaned forward in their pew, uncertain what was happening, but certain it was not part of the planned ceremony, and Charles Tilney's self-satisfied expression began to crack into something approaching concern. "Georgiana," Lord Dashwood hissed under his breath, his grip on her arm tightening painfully. "What are you doing? Continue walking this instant." But Georgiana had spent 3 days and nights composing her ending, had practiced in her mind exactly what she would say and how she would say it, and now that the moment had arrived, she found her voice was steady and clear, carrying across the silent church with perfect projection. "I cannot do this," she said, not whispering but speaking at full volume so every person assembled could hear her clearly. "Forgive me, Father, but I cannot." The gasps that rippled through the congregation were audible, a collective intake of breath that seemed to suck all the air from the space, and Lord Dashwood's face turned the alarming purple colour it had achieved during his confrontation with Benedict at the garden party. "You will disgrace this family," he growled, his fingers digging into her arm hard enough that Georgiana knew she would have bruises to match the ones he had given her 5 weeks earlier. "You will destroy our name, our reputation, everything I have worked to build." His fury was palpable, radiating from him in waves that might have terrified her if she had not already made her choice, if she had not already decided that his approval was worth far less than her own soul. Georgiana pulled her arm free from his grip with a strength she had not known she possessed, stepping back from him and turning to face the assembled guests, all of whom were now staring with expressions ranging from shock to scandal to something that might have been admiration on a few older faces. "No," she said clearly. "I will save myself." And then she turned away from the altar, away from Charles Tilney, whose face had gone red with humiliation and rage, away from her father, who stood frozen in disbelief, away from the future that had been planned for her by people who cared nothing for her happiness, and she began to run. The wedding dress was never designed for running, its layers of silk and petticoats tangling around her legs and threatening to trip her with every step. But Georgiana gathered the fabric in her hands and fled down the aisle she had just walked, her veil streaming behind her like a banner of rebellion. Behind her, the church erupted into chaos, voices rising in shocked exclamation and avid speculation, Lord Dashwood shouting her name in tones of absolute fury, Charles Tilney demanding to know what was happening and calling after her in outraged tones about breach of contract and damaged goods. But Georgiana did not stop, did not look back, did not allow herself to consider the magnitude of what she had just done, or the consequences that would surely follow. She burst through the church doors into the bright June morning and kept running, her slippers sliding on the stone steps, her breath coming in gasps that were half exertion and half hysterical laughter at the sheer impossibility of what she was attempting. A few guests who had been lingering outside the church stared in open-mouthed astonishment as the bride ran past them still in her wedding gown. But Georgiana paid them no attention, focused entirely on reaching her destination before her father or anyone else could stop her. Benedict's townhouse was only 3 streets away, close enough that she had walked past it countless times during her years in London, and she arrived at the elegant facade, breathless and dishevelled, her carefully arranged hair already falling from its pins and her white dress acquiring stains from the dusty London streets. She pounded on the door with both fists, propriety completely abandoned in her desperation, and when the butler opened it, his eyes widened in shock at the sight of a bride in full wedding regalia standing on the doorstep demanding entry. "I must see the Duke," Georgiana gasped out between heaving breaths. "Please, it is desperately urgent. I must see him immediately." The butler's expression shifted from shock to something approaching pity, and Georgiana felt her heart plummet even before he spoke the words she somehow already knew were coming. "I regret to inform you, miss, that His Grace departed for his country estate 3 days ago. He left instructions that the London house was to be closed indefinitely, as he does not intend to return to the city for the foreseeable future." The world tilted sideways, and Georgiana gripped the doorframe to keep from collapsing as the full implication of his words penetrated her panic. Benedict was gone, had left London believing her married or about to be married, had fled to Derbyshire to avoid the pain of knowing she had chosen another. She had run from her wedding, had destroyed her reputation and her family's standing, had sacrificed everything, and the man she had done it for was not even here to know what she had chosen. Behind her she heard shouts and the sound of approaching footsteps, undoubtedly her father and possibly Charles Tilney in pursuit, and despair washed over her in a wave so powerful she thought she might drown in it. But then a familiar voice spoke from behind her, firm and practical and utterly unshakable. "Step away from the door, child. We are going to Derbyshire." Georgiana turned to find Aunt Beatrice standing on the pavement beside an elegant travelling carriage, clearly one she had arranged to have waiting nearby in anticipation of exactly this scenario, and the old woman's face wore an expression of fierce satisfaction. "I told you it is never too late to choose yourself," Aunt Beatrice said, already climbing into the carriage with surprising agility for her age. "But if you intend to finish what you have started, we must leave immediately before your father catches up. The choice is yours, Georgiana. Get in the carriage and pursue the man who wrote you that song, or stay here and face the consequences of running without following through." Georgiana did not hesitate, gathering her ridiculous wedding dress around her and practically throwing herself into the carriage, and Aunt Beatrice barely had time to pull her fully inside before she was pounding on the roof and shouting for the driver to depart with all speed. The carriage lurched into motion just as Lord Dashwood came running around the corner, his face purple with rage and his voice raised in commands that the driver cheerfully ignored, and Georgiana watched through the window as her father grew smaller and smaller behind them, his fury impotent against her determination. The journey to Derbyshire normally required 8 hours under ideal conditions, but the weather had other plans, dark clouds gathering as they left London and opening into a steady rain by the time they reached the countryside. The roads became muddy and treacherous, slowing their progress, and Georgiana sat rigid with anxiety as the hours crawled past, terrified that they would arrive too late, that Benedict would have already departed for the continent as his letter had mentioned, that her dramatic gesture would end in failure and humiliation. Aunt Beatrice maintained a running commentary designed to distract her niece from spiraling into panic, sharing stories from her own youth and her own regrets, occasionally producing food and drink from the seemingly bottomless hamper she had packed, and generally providing the steady, practical support that kept Georgiana from losing her nerve entirely. As they travelled north through increasingly wild country, the rain intensified into a proper storm, wind howling around the carriage and rain lashing the windows with such force that visibility became nearly impossible. The driver slowed to a crawl, navigating more by instinct than sight, and Georgiana began to wonder if they would make it at all, or if the weather itself was conspiring to prevent her from reaching Benedict. But finally, near midnight, the carriage pulled through gates that bore the Ashford crest and up a long drive toward a massive stone house that loomed against the stormy sky like something from a Gothic novel. Ashford Hall was far larger than Georgiana had imagined, a sprawling estate that spoke of generations of wealth and power, and as they pulled up before the main entrance, she felt a moment of pure terror at the audacity of what she was doing, arriving unannounced at a duke's country seat in the middle of the night, wearing a ruined wedding dress and demanding to see the master. A startled footman opened the door, clearly not expecting visitors at this hour and in this weather, and his eyes widened comically at the sight of the bedraggled bride emerging from the carriage. "I must see the Duke," Georgiana said, too exhausted and desperate for politeness. "Please, I know it is late and irregular, but I must see him immediately. It is a matter of utmost urgency." The footman seemed torn between his training in proper protocol and the obvious distress of the woman before him, but Aunt Beatrice settled the matter by sweeping past him into the entrance hall with the authority of someone accustomed to getting her way. "Announce to your master that Lady Beatrice Gardiner and her niece Miss Georgiana Dashwood have arrived and require his immediate presence," she commanded. "And bring blankets. The girl is soaked through." The footman scurried away, and within moments an elderly butler appeared, his expression professionally neutral despite the unprecedented situation. "His Grace is in the music room," he said carefully. "He has been there since returning from London 3 days ago. He does not wish to be disturbed." "Then he shall have to make an exception," Aunt Beatrice said firmly. "Show us the way." The butler led them through corridors that seemed to stretch endlessly, past rooms shrouded in Holland covers and portraits of stern ancestors, until finally they reached a door from beneath which a faint light showed. The butler knocked softly, received no response, and knocked again with more force before finally opening the door and announcing the visitors despite the lack of invitation. The music room at Ashford Hall was smaller than Georgiana had expected, more intimate than grand, with a single lamp burning on a table beside the pianoforte and moonlight struggling through storm clouds to illuminate the space with fitful silver. And there, sitting at the instrument in the darkness, was Benedict. He was not playing, merely sitting with his hands resting motionless on the keys, his posture conveying such profound dejection that Georgiana felt her heart break for him, even as hope surged in her chest. He did not turn at the butler's announcement, did not seem to register that anyone had entered, and the servant withdrew quietly after exchanging a meaningful look with Aunt Beatrice, who positioned herself just inside the doorway, clearly intending to serve as chaperone, but equally clearly prepared to give them as much privacy as propriety would allow. Georgiana moved forward slowly, her sodden wedding dress leaving a trail of water across the polished floor, her hair hanging in wet tangles around her shoulders, her appearance the absolute opposite of the perfect bride who had stood in that London church what felt like a lifetime ago. She stopped beside the pianoforte, close enough to touch him but not yet daring to, and when she spoke his name, her voice came out barely above a whisper. Benedict. He went absolutely still, every muscle tensing as if he had been struck, but he did not turn toward her or acknowledge her presence in any way. Georgiana, he said finally, his voice rough and broken. You are not here. You are married by now. This is merely another hallucination, another cruel trick my mind is playing to torture me with what I cannot have. The pain in his words gave her courage, and she moved closer, reaching out to touch his shoulder with trembling fingers. I am here, she said softly. I am real. And I am not married. Benedict finally turned to look at her, and even in the dim lamplight, she could see the devastation in his face, the evidence of days spent in grief and isolation. His eyes widened as he took in her appearance, the wedding dress unmistakable even in its ruined state, and confusion joined the pain in his expression. Georgiana, he breathed. You should be. What have you done? She sat beside him on the piano bench, heedless of how her wet dress would damage the instrument or the impropriety of their closeness, and placed her hands on the keys beside his. I am finishing our song, she said, her voice gaining strength and certainty. Listen. And then she began to play, her fingers finding the melody he had written for her, the composition she had memorized over the past 3 nights, playing it from memory rather than from sheet music because she carried it now in her heart rather than on a page. Benedict sat frozen beside her, listening as she moved through the piece with all the emotion he had taught her to express, no longer playing mechanically, but pouring her whole self into the music. When she reached the unresolved chord, she paused for just a heartbeat, and then her fingers moved through the ending she had composed, the triumphant resolution that transformed the melody from melancholy to joy, from question to answer, from uncertainty to absolute conviction. The final major chord rang through the music room, and in the silence that followed, Georgiana turned to find Benedict staring at her with tears streaming down his face. You came, he whispered, as if still unable to believe the evidence of his own eyes and ears. You actually came. She reached up to cup his face in her hands, feeling the dampness of his tears against her palms. You wrote me a love letter in music, she said. Did you think I would not answer? His hands came up to cover hers, pressing them more firmly against his face as if afraid she might disappear if he let go. Your father, your reputation, society, he said, his voice breaking on the words. You have sacrificed everything. Georgiana shook her head, feeling her own tears begin to fall, mingling with the rain that still dripped from her hair. "No," she said fiercely. "I have sacrificed nothing. I have finally chosen everything that matters." And then Benedict was kissing her, his mouth finding hers with desperate intensity, and Georgiana was kissing him back with equal fervor, 5 weeks of longing and loss and love pouring into that connection. His arms came around her, pulling her close despite the wet dress soaking through his own clothes, and she wrapped her arms around his neck, neither of them caring about propriety or witnesses or anything beyond the overwhelming relief of being together, finally, honestly, without lies or barriers between them. When they finally broke apart, both breathless and laughing through their tears, Benedict rested his forehead against hers. "I was planning to leave for Italy tomorrow," he confessed. "I could not bear to stay in England knowing you were married to another, knowing I would never see you again or hear you play with the passion I taught you to express. The music had become unbearable without you to share it with." Georgiana pulled back enough to look into his eyes, her hands still cradled around his face. "Charles Tilney never wanted me for myself," she said. "My father offered him an enormous dowry to secure the match quickly after our scandal, to marry me off before anyone could discover the truth of our lessons. It was a business transaction, nothing more. I was to be purchased like one of his textile shipments, managed like one of his properties. We have both been prisoners of other people's plans, but now we are free." Benedict's expression shifted into something that looked like wonder, and he turned to the pianoforte, his hands finding the opening notes of Georgiana's song. "Play with me," he said. "Let me hear how it sounds when we create the music together rather than separately." Georgiana positioned her hands beside his, and together they began to play. 4 hands on one instrument, their fingers crossing and tangling and separating in patterns that required perfect synchronization and absolute trust. The music that emerged was more beautiful than anything either could have created alone, a testament to collaboration and partnership. And as the melody swelled through the small music room, Georgiana understood that this was what their future would be, not one person leading and the other following, but both of them creating something larger than themselves through honest connection and shared purpose. Outside, the storm continued to rage, wind howling around the corners of Ashford Hall and rain beating against the windows in sheets. But inside the music room, 2 people who had believed themselves broken beyond repair discovered that they had only been waiting for each other to become whole. Aunt Beatrice watched from her position by the door, a satisfied smile on her weathered face, and when the music finally ended and the 2 at the piano turned to look at her, she nodded as if confirming something she had always known. "Well then," the old woman said practically, "I suppose we should discuss the arrangements. You cannot marry for at least 3 months, Georgiana, not without appearing to confirm every scandalous rumor. And Benedict, you will need to make your intentions publicly known and endure society's speculation with more grace than you have shown in the past 7 years. But if you are both willing to weather the storm, quite literally in this case, then I suspect you will emerge stronger for it." Benedict stood, drawing Georgiana up with him, his hand firmly clasping hers as if he would never let go. "I will endure whatever society demands, if it means I can eventually call her my wife," he said. "I have hidden from the world for 7 years, but I will hide no longer. Not from scandal, not from speculation, not from anything, because what we have found together is worth fighting for." Georgiana looked at the man beside her, at the music they had created together, at the ending she had chosen for herself rather than accepting the one others had written, and she felt more alive than she had in years, perhaps more alive than she had ever been. The wedding dress she wore was ruined, her reputation was in tatters, Her father would likely never forgive her, and she had no idea how they would navigate the social consequences of her rebellion. But she had chosen herself, had chosen love over duty and authenticity over appearance, and standing in that music room, with Benedict's hand in hers and the echo of their shared melody still resonating in the air, Georgiana Dashwood knew she had finally composed the ending that her heart had been yearning to create all along. Spring had returned to Derbyshire with extravagant abundance, transforming the grounds of Ashford Hall into a riot of colour and life that would have been unimaginable 18 months earlier, when the estate had stood shuttered and grief-stricken, a monument to loss rather than a home for living. Now, in April of 1853, the gardens blazed with tulips and daffodils, the ancient trees wore new green leaves like celebrations, and the windows of the great house stood open to admit warm breezes carrying the scent of growth and possibility. The music room on the ground floor had undergone the most dramatic transformation of all. The space that had once been draped in white sheets and filled with dust now painted in warm cream that seemed to glow in the sunlight streaming through uncovered windows. Vases of spring flowers positioned on every available surface filling the air with fragrance, and comfortable chairs arranged in intimate semicircles to accommodate the audience gathering for this afternoon's concert. Georgiana stood at one of those windows looking out over the rose garden. Benedict had planted in Clara's memory, a space he had avoided for years, but now tended with careful reverence, understanding finally that honoring the past did not require remaining trapped in it. She rested one hand on the swell of her belly, visible now at 5 months pregnant, and felt the flutter of movement that still filled her with wonder every time it occurred. Behind her, she could hear Benedict arranging sheet music on the pianoforte stands, humming softly to himself, in a habit he had developed over the past 16 months of their marriage, the sound of a man who had rediscovered joy and could not quite contain it. The guests would arrive within the hour, not London society's elite, who had spent the past year dissecting every detail of the scandalous marriage between the ghost duke and the runaway bride, but the local families who had welcomed them both with surprising warmth, tenant farmers and village merchants, and a few genuine friends who valued the music they created more than the gossip surrounding their union. "Are you nervous?" Benedict asked, coming to stand beside her at the window and placing his hand over hers on her belly, a gesture that had become as natural as breathing. They have all heard the gossip about the Duke's scandalous bride who fled her own wedding. Some travelled from neighbouring counties specifically to see the woman bold enough to run from the church in her wedding dress. Georgiana turned to smile at him, struck as she still was daily by how much he had changed from the devastated man she had found sitting in darkness that stormy night. The lines of grief that had marked his face had not disappeared entirely, but they had been joined by lines of laughter, and his eyes held light rather than shadow, hope rather than despair. "Let them gossip," she said calmly, reaching up to adjust his cravat with the casual intimacy of long familiarity. "We will give them something better to talk about, the music we make together. That will be our answer to every whisper and speculation." The first guests began arriving shortly after, local families dressed in their finest, clearly somewhat awed by the grandeur of Ashford Hall, but welcomed so warmly by both Duke and Duchess that their nervousness quickly transformed into comfortable excitement. Children ran across the lawns outside, their laughter floating through the open windows, while inside the music room, adults took their seats and accepted glasses of wine and engaged in the pleasant small talk that preceded any performance. Aunt Beatrice arrived in a flurry of dark silk and sharp observations, having made the journey from her Kent estate specifically for this concert, and she immediately began holding court among the local matrons, regaling them with the story of how she had helped her niece escape that disastrous London wedding. Best decision the girl ever made, running from that church. Aunt Beatrice declared to anyone within hearing. That pompous fool Tilney married. The Miller heiress within 2 months did not even pretend to mourn the loss. The settlement he had to return to Lord Dashwood nearly bankrupted him, which I consider divine justice of the finest sort. Georgiana caught her aunt's eye across the room and smiled, grateful as always for the fierce old woman who had made her rebellion possible, who had provided not just practical assistance, but moral support when the weight of social disapproval had threatened to crush her spirits during those first difficult months. The scandal had been enormous, of course, with every drawing-room in London discussing little else for weeks. But here in Derbyshire, far from society's judgment, Georgiana and Benedict had built a life that felt more authentic than anything either had experienced in their previous existence. As the room filled and the concert's start time approached, a late arrival caused a stir near the doorway, and Georgiana looked up to see her sister, Lydia, being shown into the music room by a somewhat flustered footman. The younger Dashwood girl looked different than she had 18 months ago, less frivolous somehow, her expression uncertain as she scanned the room looking for her sister. When their eyes met, Lydia's face crumpled slightly, a mixture of hope and apprehension that made Georgiana's heart ache, despite the pain her sister's revelation had caused. Benedict, standing beside his wife, felt her stiffen and placed a steadying hand on her lower back. "Do you want me to have her removed?" he asked quietly. "You owe her nothing after what she did." But Georgiana shook her head, moving forward to greet her sister with more grace than Lydia probably deserved, remembering the forgiveness her aunt had extended to her own mistakes, and knowing that holding on to bitterness would only create another cage. "Lydia," she said simply, "I did not expect you." Lydia's eyes filled with tears, and she reached out to grasp Georgiana's hands with desperate intensity. "I know I have no right to be here after what I did," she said, her voice breaking. "I was jealous and spiteful, and I nearly destroyed your chance at happiness. I have been trying to find the courage to contact you for months, to beg your forgiveness. And when I heard about the concert, I thought perhaps if I came in person, if you could see how truly sorry I am, then maybe." She trailed off, unable to complete the thought, and Georgiana felt the last of her resentment dissolve. "I have learned that holding on to bitterness only creates more cages," she said gently, pulling her sister into an embrace. "Yes, Lydia, I forgive you." The relief on Lydia's face was palpable, and she clung to Georgiana for a long moment before pulling back to examine her sister's changed appearance, the confidence and radiance that had replaced the hollow misery of those weeks before the failed wedding. "You look happy," Lydia whispered. "Truly happy, not just pretending." "I am," Georgiana confirmed. "Happier than I ever imagined possible, when I was trying to be the daughter father wanted instead of the woman I actually am." "How is he?" Lydia's expression clouded. "He has not forgiven you and likely never will. He speaks of you rarely, and when he does, it is only to rail against your selfishness and disregard for family honor. But Georgiana, the rest of us, we understand now what you were escaping. Charles Tilney's new wife is miserable. Everyone can see it. He treats her exactly as he would have treated you, like a possession to be managed rather than a person to be cherished. You saved yourself, and I should have helped you instead of betraying you." The reconciliation with Lydia was interrupted by Aunt Beatrice announcing loudly that the concert should begin before they lost the good light, and the assembled guests settled into their chairs with anticipatory silence. Georgiana took her position at the pianoforte with Benedict beside her, their arrangement now so practiced that they moved in perfect synchronization, and she felt the familiar flutter of nerves that always preceded performance, mixed with excitement at sharing something so personal with an audience that would appreciate it for its artistry rather than dissect it for scandal. "We will begin," Benedict announced to the room, with a composition that has become known locally as the Ashford composition, though its proper title is Georgiana's Song. It was written during a period of great difficulty for us both, but it has become a testament to the possibility of choosing authenticity over expectation, of finding love in unexpected places, and of creating beauty from the raw materials of loss and longing. My wife will perform the piece as it was originally written, and I will accompany her. And together we hope to show you that music, like life, is most powerful when it comes from genuine feeling rather than mere technical perfection. Georgiana's hands found the opening notes, and the melody that had changed her life began to fill the music room with its complex emotional journey from sorrow through yearning to triumphant resolution. She played with all the skill Benedict had helped her develop over those 3 weeks of midnight lessons and the 16 months of marriage that had followed, but more importantly, she played with the authentic emotion she had learned to access, letting the music speak truths that words could never capture. Benedict's accompaniment wove around her melody like a conversation, supporting without overwhelming, enhancing without dominating, a perfect representation of the partnership they had forged. As she moved through the piece, Georgiana was aware of the audience responding, handkerchiefs emerging to dab at eyes, heads nodding in time with the rhythm. The kind of genuine engagement that came from music that spoke to the human heart rather than simply showcasing technical prowess. When she reached the ending, she had composed that midnight in the music room, the resolution that transformed the piece from question to answer, from uncertainty to conviction. She felt Benedict's pride radiating from beside her, and she poured everything she felt into those final triumphant chords. The silence that followed the last note was profound, lasting several heartbeats before the room erupted into enthusiastic applause. Not the polite recognition of a society musical, but the warm appreciation of people genuinely moved by what they had witnessed. Several of the tenant farmers were openly weeping, and the local vicar was nodding as if the music had confirmed something he had long suspected about the nature of divine grace. Aunt Beatrice was beaming with undisguised satisfaction, and even Lydia looked awed, as if seeing her sister truly for the first time. As the applause continued, Benedict stood and raised his hand for silence, his expression suggesting he had an announcement to make. "My wife and I have been collaborating on more than just this single piece," he said. "Over the past 16 months we have composed numerous works together, and I have also rediscovered my ability to create music independently, something I had believed lost forever after my first wife's death. Georgiana has also begun composing her own pieces, displaying a talent for musical creation that she had never been permitted to explore before our marriage. We have compiled these various compositions into a collection that will be published next month under both our names, an unprecedented collaboration between husband and wife, between Duke and Duchess, but more importantly between two artists who have found in each other the courage to create authentically." The announcement caused excited murmuring among the guests, several of whom immediately pledged to purchase copies of the publication, and Georgiana felt a surge of pride at how far she had come from the woman who had played Mozart with mechanical precision in her father's drawing room. Benedict's willingness to share credit equally, to acknowledge her contributions as worthy of publication alongside his own more experienced compositions, was perhaps the greatest gift he had given her beyond his love itself. As the concert continued with several more pieces from their forthcoming collection, Georgiana found herself observing the transformed music room with deep satisfaction. The space that had been a tomb for grief when she first encountered it, that had become a sanctuary for secret lessons and forbidden connection, that had stood empty and abandoned during those terrible weeks of wedding preparation, was now vibrant with community and shared joy. The contrast between this bright, flower-filled room full of people genuinely appreciating music, and the cold, dusty space she had fled to that first midnight, could not have been more complete, and she understood that the transformation of the room reflected the transformation of her own life. After the concert concluded and the guests had moved to the gardens for refreshments, Georgiana found a quiet moment alone with Benedict in the music room, both of them standing at the windows watching their guests enjoy the spring afternoon. She had been waiting for the right moment to share her news, and now, surrounded by the evidence of the life they had built together, felt like the perfect time. "I have something to tell you," she said softly, taking his hand and placing it more firmly on her belly where the baby had begun moving more actively. "The physicians I have been seeing, the best in London as you insisted, have examined me thoroughly. Unlike Clara, I have no heart condition, no complications, nothing that suggests this pregnancy will be anything other than completely normal and safe. But I know you are frightened, and I want you to hear me say this clearly. Benedict, I am not Clara. This is not that story. This is ours." Benedict's hand trembled slightly against her belly, and she watched emotions play across his face, joy and fear and hope all mingling together. "I know," he said, his voice rough with feeling. "Rationally, I know that you are different, that the circumstances are different, that I have taken every possible precaution this time, but there are moments, usually late at night when I cannot sleep, when the old guilt rises up and whispers that I destroy everything I love, that I will lose you too, that allowing myself to hope for this child is tempting fate." Georgiana turned to face him fully, taking his face in her hands the way she had that stormy night when she had arrived at Ashford Hall in her ruined wedding dress. "Every day with you," Benedict said before she could speak, "every single day, I learn to trust happiness again. You have given me back the ability to compose, to hope, to live as something more than a ghost haunting my own estates. This child, our child, represents the final healing of wounds I thought would never close. I am frightened, yes, but I am also more hopeful than I have been in 7 years, and that hope is your gift to me." They stood together in the music room as afternoon light turned golden, holding each other and their unborn child in a moment of such perfect peace that Georgiana wished she could capture it in music the way Benedict had captured his feelings in Georgiana's song. Outside the windows, the gardens bloomed with extravagant life, roses in Clara's memorial garden opening their petals to the sun, children from tenant families playing games on the lawn, guests enjoying refreshments and conversation in the warm spring air. The Derbyshire countryside stretched away in all directions, showing the promise of renewal and growth that came with this season of rebirth. Later that evening, after the guests had departed, and Lydia had left with promises to visit again soon and work toward mending their fractured family connections, after Aunt Beatrice had retired to her guest chamber, with declarations that this had been the most satisfying concert she had attended in decades, Georgiana and Benedict returned to the music room for their nightly ritual of playing together. But tonight, instead of performing pieces from their collection or working on new compositions, Benedict produced sheet music he had been keeping secret, a piece he had written specifically for this moment. "It is a lullaby," he explained, positioning the music on the stand. "For our child, whoever they turn out to be. I have been composing it in pieces over the past months, adding to it as I have learned to trust that this pregnancy will result in joy rather than tragedy, and I finished it this morning before the concert. I want us to play it together, to give our child their first music as a gift from both of us." The lullaby was beautiful in its simplicity, a gentle melody that spoke of protection and love and welcome, and as they played it together in the gathering dusk, Georgiana felt tears sliding down her cheeks at the tenderness Benedict had woven into every measure. This was the man who had been called cursed, who had been blamed for his wife's death, who had hidden from the world for 7 years, believing himself incapable of creating anything but destruction. And here he was, composing lullabies for their unborn child, daring to hope for a future he had thought forever beyond his reach, transformed by love and music and the courage to choose authenticity over fear. When the lullaby ended, they sat together at the pianoforte in comfortable silence, watching through the windows as spring twilight painted the gardens in shades of purple and gold. Somewhere in the house, servants were preparing dinner, going about the ordinary business of maintaining a household that was no longer a monument to grief, but a home filled with life and possibility. Somewhere in London, Lord Dashwood was likely still nursing his fury at his daughter's rebellion, unable or unwilling to see that she had saved herself rather than disgraced the family. Somewhere, Charles Tilney was probably pontificating to his miserable wife about proper household management while she dreamed of escape. But here, in this music room that had witnessed so much transformation, two people who had chosen each other against all expectation and propriety sat together in perfect harmony, literally and figuratively, creating music that would welcome new life into a world they had learned to navigate on their own terms. The story that had begun with Georgiana sobbing in an empty music room at midnight, alone and lost and trapped by expectation, had come full circle to this moment of triumph, with her sitting beside the man she loved, in a music room flooded with spring sunlight, pregnant with their child, composing her own music and living the life her mother had dreamed of, but never dared to claim. She had learned that choosing yourself was not selfish but essential, that running from a cage was not cowardice, but courage, that love built on authentic connection was worth any scandal society might create. And as Benedict began to improvise a new melody, something joyful and playful that made her laugh and join in, Georgiana Dashwood Wentworth, Duchess of Ashford and composer in her own right, understood that the music they were creating together, both literally at this pianoforte and metaphorically in the life they were building, was the most beautiful composition of all, one that would continue to evolve and grow and surprise them for all the years to come. The music room that had been a space of secrets and sorrow had become a space of celebration and authenticity, and the woman who had once played with flawless technique and no feeling now played with both skill and soul, her technical precision enhanced rather than diminished by the emotion she had learned to express. As the last light faded from the sky and candles were lit throughout the music room, casting everything in warm, golden glow, Georgiana and Benedict continued to play, their music floating out through the open windows into the Derbyshire night, a testament to the transformative power of choosing love over duty, authenticity over appearance, and the courage to compose your own ending rather than accepting the one others have written for you.